The Glendale Road Church of Christ proudly presents a weekly exploration of the Word of our living God. This is It Is Written with Minister Stephen Hunter.
In this passage, we're able to take a glimpse and see not only the divinity of Jesus, but also His humanity for a moment. As He withdrew from His disciples, kneeling down to pray, we see at odds the divine will and the human will. The human will of Jesus saying, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. But then that divine side of Him saying, nevertheless, not my will but yours be done. This is a struggle that many of us have. That is, we want God to have His way, but on the same hand, sometimes the methods of God are less than pleasant. And so we don't want to actually have to encounter or live or go through things the way necessarily that God has created for us. But Jesus was full aware of what He was about to endure. He was full aware of all the agony and all the pain that He was about to go through. He was anticipating this very thing. And so we see here in Luke's Gospel that as He is in agony, verse 44, He didn't just give up, but rather He gave Himself to a more earnest prayer. Now, I don't know what necessarily the difference is in praying and praying earnestly. Maybe you could think a greater intensity of prayer, but praying more earnestly and being in agony, He began to sweat drops of blood. Now, this is the basis that I want to build upon here in a moment. But when I was a teenager, driving, I guess I was about 16 or 17, my mother, I noticed she would come home every day from work and immediately she'd go straight to bed and take a nap for a couple of hours before my father would get home. And she would get up and then she would go about making dinner and preparing, the meal and cleaning room, doing laundry, cleaning the house rather, doing laundry and whatnot. And I noticed something curious about her, and that was that she could be happy one minute, but then at the drop of a dime, she could be either angry or crying. And Daddy and I didn't understand what exactly was going on. And on one occasion, I actually, when I came home from school or perhaps even work one evening, I opened the door and and as I walked in, popped my head around, and she's sitting there on the couch, and I just asked her, who's here today? Because her moods were so erratic. And then on top of that, during this period of time, the company she worked for, Service Merchandise, some of you may remember that company, they shut down, and so she received a little bit of a payout and was unemployed. But during that time, one would think that having unemployment and having a little bit of a severance package that you'd want to hold on that and to spend it wisely until you found another job. But she went on a spending spree, and that created tension between her and my daddy. Well, long of the short, she went to her medical doctor, and her primary care physician believed that she was dealing with a depression. And what had happened is they talked, she disclosed that when she was a teenager, she had been in a car accident, and she did sustain head injury. And so the doctor was saying that because of medical conditions and needs at that time, that likely her chemical makeup became imbalanced, and this was to attribute to her mood swings, to some of her erratic behaviors and so forth. She was eventually sent by recommendation to a respected psychiatrist in Nashville, and his diagnosis was that she was bipolar and manic depressive. And now I say all that to say that you can ask even Stephanie, because we were dating at the time, but who my mother was then versus who she is now, they're like two completely different people. It's like the mother that I grew up with and that I'd known for so long, it's like she's dead. But there her body is, there I can still hear her voice, but how she is and who she used to be is a person that's long gone. And now we have this person with us that we still love and cherish, but that we're struggling to know quite how to relate to, how to accommodate, and so forth. And she has been through nightmares of bouts of depression. And, she used to be the type of woman that always was chipper. She was always an encourager. She's one of those nice, sweet church ladies that, people love to be around, but she's withdrawn now to herself. And she doesn't like to you'll never meet her probably, because she would not come into a crowd of this size, let alone even a smaller crowd. It unsettles her very much. But with this sickness and illness that she's had to grapple with for so long, we have learned to be accommodating and how to deal with her in her depression. And it can be, I know as much as it's hard for her, it can also be difficult for the ones who love people that are going through and struggling with mental illnesses too. And so there's that story of a personal nature. And then almost 6 years ago, when my family and I left New Concord to go to Monroe County in Kentucky, we went to a congregation and hadn't been there 3 or 4 months when one of the gentlemen of the church had called me on my cell phone and notified me that one of the older couples of the church had a daughter who had taken her life, and they had just found her. And so he was in the middle of finding out what all was happening, and he said, "Do you want to go with me when I get off work this evening to go and visit the family?" And I said, "Yeah, by all means." And so he stopped by and picked me up, and we went. And, there's nothing you can say to a family or to a mother and father whose child has tragically taken their own life. And so we sat there and of course, hugged them and prayed with them and cried with them and loved them. But what they disclosed, the husband followed us out when we left. He said that their daughter had been struggling with depression and had been on medication for it. And what he learned is that she was feeling so great because of her medication that she thought she didn't need it anymore. And so she quit taking it cold turkey. Now, a lot of those types of medications, if you'll read the fine print, you'll learn that you're not to quit taking it abruptly because it can cause suicidal tendencies. But there we were at a funeral of a lady who was probably my age or a few years older, and she had fought with this demon and lost. Some of you are those who have or are currently struggling with mental illness of some sort or another. It may be a depression, it may be an anxiety. And it's something that's very seldom addressed from a church or from a pulpit simply because a lot of us don't really know what to do or what to say. And I know that a lot of well-meaning and loving Christians have probably said something along the lines of, you need to have more faith. You need to pray more. Well, while I understand that folks may have the best of intentions and they mean well, when you tell a person that's depressed or that has anxiety that they need to have more faith or pray more, all you do is create additional depression and anxiety for them. Because on top of the anxiety that they have, or the depression that they have, you say, have deeper faith, pray more. They become more depressed or anxious over the fact that now they're questioning whether or not they have the faith that they ought to have. And it's an unnecessary added burden upon such people. But when we look to the Bible, one of the things that sticks out to my mind comes from Hebrews 4:15, where the writer says there, we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. And you may look through these lenses and say, how is it possible that I or my loved one who fights with mental illness issues, how is it at all that Jesus can be a sympathetic high priest to the plight that they face? And that is, I think, a legitimate question. It's one that I am sure many have asked before. It's one that I have wondered myself. And it wasn't until I was just doing a good, deep reading and study of the agony and the crucifixion and the scourging of Jesus that I came to find the answer. There is a book I would commend to you called The Case for Easter by Lee Strobel. Now, Lee Strobel is a guy, he was an investigative journalist. He used to be an atheist. And because of his atheism, he decided to put his skills to the test, and he wanted to seek out the evidence. Does God really exist? And so he's got a book called The Case for God. And then he wanted to find out if Jesus Christ was truly God's Son. And so he has a book out called The Case for Jesus, and another book called The Case for Faith, some of which we may very well have in our own church library. And I know that those who have put a lot of effort into that library would be very pleased to open those doors and let you seek and find these books. But in The Case for Easter, and Lee Strobel's method in each of these books, he sits down with people who supposedly can help him find the answers. But he still approaches as the skeptic, and he asks them, well, what about? And he brings up a lot of the objections that atheists and doubters and skeptics still have today. And in his book, The Case for Easter, he's giving a thorough examination of the agony of Jesus, but also the Roman scourging of Jesus, as well as the crucifixion. And so some of the questions that he asks and answers in this book is, did Jesus just pass out or did he really die? Now, that's a common objection to his death from many skeptics. But anyway, I'll not get into the deep thoughts of his book, but I do want to read to you an excerpt about his torture. Lee Strobel is interviewing a gentleman he's Dr. Metherell, and he is a physician, but he also has an intimate knowledge of Roman practices of antiquity as they used to scourge, beat, flog, and crucify people. And I want to read to you what he says. Strobel writes, he cleared his throat, and the doctor begins by saying, it began after the Last Supper. Jesus went with his disciples to the Mount of Olives, specifically to the Garden of Gethsemane. And there, if you remember, he prayed all night. Now, during that process, he was anticipating the coming events of the next day. Since he knew the amount of suffering he was going to have to endure, he was quite naturally experiencing a great deal of psychological stress. Strobel says, I raised my hand to stop him. Whoa! Here's what skeptics have a field day. Here's where skeptics have a field day, I told him. The Gospels tell us that he began to sweat blood at this point. Now, come on, isn't that just a product of some overactive imagination? Doesn't that call into question the accuracy of the Gospel writers? Unfazed, the doctor shook his head. Not at all. He replied, this is a known medical condition called hematidrosis. It's not very common, but it is associated with a high degree of psychological stress. What happens is that severe anxiety causes the release of chemicals to break down the capillaries, which are the smallest blood vessels. They break down the capillaries in the sweat glands. As a result, there's a small amount of bleeding into these glands, and the sweat comes out tinged with blood. We're not talking about a lot of blood. It's just a very, very small amount. Though a bit chastened, I pressed on, Strobel writes. Did this have any other effect on the body? The doctor replies, what this did was set up the skin to become extremely fragile so that when Jesus was flogged by the Roman soldier the next day, his skin would be very, very sensitive. Tucked here in Luke's Gospel, Luke being the physician we read about in the Colossian letter, tucked here in Luke's Gospel, this factoid that Jesus began sweating blood, coupled with modern-day medical science, what brought on that sweating of blood was psychological stress and a deep, agonizing anxiety. Now, I ask you this. If you had been there with Jesus, would you have said to him, Jesus, you need to have more faith? Would you have said to Jesus, Jesus, you need to pray more? Well, we wouldn't have said the second one because he was in fact praying when all this was happening. But I read about the sympathetic high priest who is Christ our Lord. And then you couple all these facts together, and you can confidently say that in this respect, Jesus understands what it's like to fight that battle of a mental illness, though His was confined to a shorter period of time than many people's. Many people live with this daily. And I know that some don't believe in such a thing, and you're free to believe what you want. But obviously, one of the most complicated parts of the body, I think, to understand is the brain. I have a good friend who's a colonel with the United States Army. Ricky Hagan is his name. And Ricky has just published a DVD where he speaks about post-traumatic stress disorder. He served in Desert Storm, and he has been serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. As a matter of fact, when we were in Monroe County, he showed me a picture of the very little hole that Saddam Hussein was hiding in. He wasn't with the company that found him, but lots of his friends were. And so he showed me these pictures. But Ricky told me that he suffered a head injury in battle, in combat, and so he is now under doctor's care for post-traumatic stress disorder because it has messed up the chemical makeup of his brain. He still functions as well as you and I do, but he's very quick-tempered, and he said a lot of the soldiers that come back from war, though they may not have physical, visible scars, many of them have scars that we simply can't see. And what Ricky was stressing to me is the reality that, these things really do exist. Contrary to what people may say. Decades ago, they would have called it shell shock. Today, it's rightly called post-traumatic stress disorder. But nevertheless, you take the reality of Jesus' agony. Now, I have never been so anxious as to sweat drops of blood, and I dare say many of you haven't either. I have never been under such a great deal of psychological stress to be brought to that point in my life that Jesus was brought to. And I would venture to say, neither have many of us. But though you face your demons, and I really do, and if you want to believe demon in the literal sense or the figurative sense, it's fine with me. But I'm going to tell you, it's not an angel that gives this to you. About 1.5 years ago, shortly before we came here, I found myself on a Sunday morning in my bedroom, in our master bedroom, windows, blinds, and curtains shut, under the covers, unable to get out. I had no clue what was happening to me. I felt like the walls were closing in, and I was supposed to preach that morning. And so I had to call the elder and say, I can't go and preach. I'm sick. And that's what we told our children at the time. Daddy's sick. I've never felt such a loss of control or never lived with such a feeling as an anxiety attack. But that's what I was having. And it is a nightmare. Though the sun was shining, I felt trapped in my own body. I felt trapped in my own mind. I couldn't get out. And so I did what a good person of faith, I would hope, would do. I turned to God in prayer, and I was begging God, please let this pass. Please take this away. I don't like it. I don't want it. Please take it. Well, God said no. And it brought to my mind a passage that Paul wrote. In 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 to 10, Paul said, "Lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." Paul says, "Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." You have likely, if you fight a mental illness, have prayed to God, take this away. Give me some sort of relief. And you find yourself daily still living with this very struggle. But Paul helps us to frame a new perspective around this particular struggle. And that is maybe it's in our life for a purpose. Now, I never would have thought clinical anxiety had a good purpose. Never would have thought that. But someone shared with me an article written by a doctor, and they were saying, here are some of the traits that people with anxiety have that others typically don't. One of the traits, the one that really stuck out to me, was people with anxiety typically have a deeper sense of empathy. Now, empathy means that a person can listen to you tell your story, and they can literally, in a sense, put themselves in your shoes, see the matter with your mind, and feel the same emotions about it that you feel. Doesn't mean that they agree or disagree. They're just able to do it. And I thought, well, I'd never thought about that. And I don't know, maybe that's a good trait. Gary, maybe that's a good trait to have as a preacher. But what I would want you to know above anything, the reason we fight these battles with mental illness, the reason I fight a daily battle with anxiety, and I'm thankful I've got this little pill bottle, I call it my happy pills. I'm going to make a joke of everything. That's just how I do things. And so I told Steve, I said, got to take my happy pill. So I go take my happy pill. And I'm not going to be ashamed of it. It doesn't make me lesser of a person. Maybe it makes me have something that I wouldn't have otherwise had. But it also helps to keep me focused on God and Jesus, whereas like Paul, maybe I would be prone to be arrogant and exalt myself in a manner that I shouldn't. But I have learned that though I take my happy pill every morning and I try to avoid people that I don't like, which not real easy when you go to church here, right? Okay, I'm glad you laughed. I was hoping you wouldn't have taken me seriously. But in all honesty, through my own walk with anxiety, I don't think I have depression, but I do have what's called generalized anxiety. I've seen the grace and the sufficiency of the grace of God in my life through it. And I have also realized that because of this very weakness that I detest, that I'm able to see the strength of God and His hand in a lot more things. And so maybe for that reason, I needed that humbling. I'm not saying that's everybody's story, and I know many of you probably may feel, I don't feel I've done anything to deserve this, and I don't think I have either. It's just a part of life. But one of the great things about the narrative of Jesus is that His story did not stop in the garden with the sweat drops of blood. It went on sadly from there to the point that He was falsely tried and accused, and then He was beaten by a Roman lictor, and then He was crucified, and all that, friends, for our sins. You ever find yourself asking, does Jesus care? I promise you, yes, Jesus does care. And the death that He died wouldn't have meant anything without the resurrection. And because He rose from the grave, we, as humans on this earth, by God's grace, can reenact that death, burial, and resurrection by faith, professing Christ as our Lord, and being buried with Him in baptism. If you've not done that, we'd love to be able to assist you. But if you're one who fights this battle and you need support, you're tired of feeling like you have to hide it from everybody, if you would just like prayers, we're here to help. Just come to the front as we stand and sing.
Holy words,
This has been It Is Written, presented by the Glendale Road Church of Christ. We welcome your visits and communications at any time.
resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart.